The most interesting game from round 4 of the FIDE Grand Prix tournament in Tashkent was between Mamedyarov and Hikaru Nakamura. Both these players love to fight for the initiative, and I think we really saw that in this game here. It starts out as a very regular Queen's Gambit declined, exchange variation, and the particular variation that's played was a big favourite of Mikhail Botvinnik. He really pioneered this in the 1950s with, several games against Petrosian in their World Championship match. And you can see that White is advancing pawns on the king's side. How can White get away with this? It looks bizarre to ignore standard development, and to fling these pawns forward here. Well, White can get away with it because his king's actually quite secure behind this central pawn chain. And what's the purpose of advancing pawns? Well, sometimes you can start some kind of kingside attack, but more often this is just about gaining space. It's actually very positional. I mean, since the 1950s, this has been tested in many games. In particular, notably, I should say, a game between Kasparov and Karpov from their World Championship match in 1985. And here Kasparov played Rook C1, and they had a very long, tense positional struggle that finally ended in a draw. But Kasparov was certainly pressing. Let me just show you a few of these moves from the game. And now King D2. So interesting that Kasparov plays like this. Basically, he's now connected his heavy pieces, and he continued to pile on pressure on the king's side. And once again, I should say the king is relatively safe here because of this strong pawn chain in the middle of the board. But very interesting, unusual strategies can arise from this position. But Mamedyarov played knight h3 instead. I should say there are improvements found for black over that game. So knight h3. And now g5. So black fights back on the king's side, contesting the ground there. And after this exchange, well, Nakamura has actually played this with white, this exact position. He played bishop g3 against Aronian. But here Aronian, I think, missed a good move. He could play knight takes g4. It's not actually sacrificing a piece, because queen d7 actually gets the piece back because of the pins here. That would have been an improvement on his game. So Mamedyarov avoided that, and instead he played bishop e5. Now this starts to get very tricky. If the rook moves, then, well, after knight f4, that's rather unpleasant for black, because you can see now the rook is unprotected, and this pin is rather annoying. The knight also looks at the bishop. Don't like that for black. So I think, understandably, Nakamura played f6. But now knight f4. So the knight is hitting bishop and pawn. Now this bishop could drop back to protect both, and now you can see that the bishop is now trapped. But I'm sure that Mamedyarov had intended this. Highly unclear piece sacrifice. But interestingly, Nakamura declined to go in for this. Instead, he took on e5. Now, if knight takes bishop, then actually after queen d6, black is okay in that position. So, for example, knight c5, then castles, black is secure. So Mamedyarov took on g6, and once again, Nakamura could go in for a position where he actually has an extra piece. Very unclear. You can see that white has this mass of pawns on the king's side. Perhaps he could advance here. Yeah, very interesting sacrifice. But Nakamura didn't want to take it. He played rook g8. And now if rook takes knight, then bishop g5, and the rook has to retreat, and black takes the knight. So knight takes bishop instead. So Mamedyarov gets his piece back. And now Nakamura closes with e4. So if we sort of take stock here, we can see that actually Mamedyarov is a pawn up. He has an extra pawn. But it's not the best pawn in the world. You could say, you know, these two are split. And black has this wonderful pawn chain. And here, well, Mamedyarov could continue in Kasparovian style with king d2 to bring his queen over to support that pawn. And well, some commentators have said, well, maybe this is the way for white to play. But I think this would be very, very difficult for white to exploit his extra pawn here. You know, he's just going to have to fall back on the defence at some moment. And yeah, I can understand why Mamedyarov didn't want to do this. He's basically on the defensive here. You know, very hard to exploit that extra pawn. Instead, true to form, Mamedyarov continued fighting for the initiative. The knight dropped back, preempting white's pawn push. Queen b3, hitting the pawn on b7, and knight f6, so the queen defends. And now another big decision for Mamedyarov. He has several ways that he can continue here. He thought for some time he must have been looking at this exchange sacrifice, for example, and then queen b7. It looks very dangerous, but the rook comes to c8, and although white wins a pawn here, well, after this, it seems to me that black's king is safe, and there's going to be some kind of counterplay here as well. He could also play a5. That's a very tempting move. And if a6, then that's certainly an improved version of this sacrifice, because this one will drop and the pawn is advanced further. That's possible, but then again, maybe black could simply play bishop takes here. But okay, white can upset black's pawn formation and perhaps play something like this. So the knight retreats, defending a check here, and then after some kind of rook c1, there'll be pressure on the queen side, so that's a possibility. But Mamedyarov chose rook c1, also highly dangerous if Nakamura declines to enter the game continuation. You know, plays castles, which perhaps on the surface looks a bit safer. Then a5, again some kind of threat to disturb black's pawn chain. And don't forget, this move could come as well. Dangerous. So, well, I think everything black does here is dangerous, actually. But so Nakamura, I think, quite bravely, courageously, he takes this pawn. Now, he would have seen that Mamedyarov intended this exchange sacrifice, and this was the game continuation. Now, rook c8 is not possible. That's not possible because obviously the bishops can be exchanged and then queen takes rook. So the rook had to come to d8. So this pawn lacks a bit of protection. Queen takes a7. So compared to the other position where we had the exchange sacrifice, you could say that white has sort of gained a move. He's managed to get the rook to c1. But now the counterplay started. Queen threatens the pawn here, so the knight has to retreat to defend that. Now, although it's just a knight defending the king, in fact, white is relatively secure here. For example, after the check, the king would just step to the side, and the king and knight hold the position. The only problem is that as white needs this knight for the defence, it means that only the queen and rook are attacking, and that means that actually Nakamura, with an extra rook in effect in defence, has no difficulties holding this position. But still, it's unbalanced. White has two pawns and a knight against a rook, so there's a lot going on in this position. But obviously, you know, white somehow needs to develop the initiative, but it's not easy. I mean, one possibility might be to play b4. But I can understand why Mamedyarov didn't want to do this, because somehow the queen looks the wrong side of these pawns. I mean, perhaps one could play for b5 here, but I'm sure white is all right in this position. Black is all right. Instead, Mamedyarov played rook c5. Okay, this is a very solid move. Basically, what he's doing is making room for the queen to come back behind the rook, so there's pressure here, and only then does he advance his pawns. But Nakamura is up to the task and brings his rook over. So you can see Nakamura very well coordinated here, and difficult for white to advance these pawns. And now, you know, Nakamura could wait maybe with rook a6, but I can understand why he didn't want to do this, because after, say, queen b3, you know, this kind of move b5 is always in the air. So instead, Nakamura played for safety. He thought, right, trade pieces. Mamedyarov exchanged, and now queen c5. If this is exchanged, then king c6, and black is probably okay here. If white could get that knight to d4 in one move, it would be a different story, but it takes too long to bring this knight round, and in the meantime the rook comes round and gets counterplay. Should be okay for black. I checked that endgame. So that was possible, but Nakamura played rook c8 instead. Gave this pawn. So now it's 3 pawns, but there is counterplay for black on the c-file. For example, if queen a4, hoping to push these pawns, then queen here, and, well, there is sufficient counterplay here. So instead, Mamedyarov played a6, and after rook a8, in fact, the players agreed to a draw. I think the simplest way for black to draw this, for white to draw this, is to play f3. And I think we're going to get a liquidation of pieces, for example, like this, and then e4, and, well, the check doesn't matter because the knight comes here. Well, they're just going to exchange all the pawns off the board, and that'll be a draw. Yes, what else? I think it's probably safest for white to play this f3, because, well, if you allow queen takes or rook take after, yeah, with this structure as it is, black could still have a few chances if he manages to win this pawn and gets pressure on f2. But f3 is absolutely clear. So a good fighting draw. But in round 4, all the games were actually drawn, which left the positions in the tournament table exactly as they were before the start of the round. So Maxime Vachier-Lagrave still leads out on his own by half a point. They had a rest day on the Saturday, and tomorrow, Sunday, they play again. Do join me. I'll be giving commentary on playchess.com live. Hopefully, see you then.